Okay, so basically, we were discussing about the public private dichotomy, and we could, as a part of the dichotomy, we could see that how the public sphere, the public realm rather, was associated with the masculine, and the private somehow got associated with the feminine. And taking the debate further, there was this debate on nature versus culture, and you know this debate became quite central in feminism, uh, and basically I would just like to point out here that Sari Otner talked about this dichotomy, where she says that there has been a resemblance of women with nature, and somehow we tend to associate culture with men. The reason being that you know uh, nature is always considered to be wild. Nature is something which lacks reason. uh, Nature might not follow any logic, so they somehow created this they were critiquing this dichotomy that went on. And here, the radical feminists, they maintain that education policy changes, they did not relieve women of their natural conditions of childbearing, because if you remember, we were discussing of something little bit on the first wave, and in the first wave they had put forth certain demands in terms of suffragist rights, in terms of right to have opportunity, in terms of employment, in terms of education. But the major problem was that they thought of leaving the home, instead of asking someone to take care of the private sphere. So that was the major fault with the first generation feminist. And that's the reason the radicals, they said that somehow the very idea of women being oppressed starts in your own personal spaces. So to this, Sari Otner has said that women are always considered as lower order beings because of their resemblance with nature, as I told you earlier. So it is her body, her biology, along with her other responsibilities of childbearing and child rearing, that makes her closer to nature. And culture as such was defined to be creative. It is always associated with men, and it requires certain kind of creativity, certain kind of reason, and certain capacities to create culture. So women in the domestic sphere, they were supposed to be having an inferior role. They represented nature, while men represented culture. Then you have a radical feminist like Sulamit Firestone. Sulamit Firestone said association of women to nature and private sphere is the primary reason for her subversion. And she was the one who pointed out that she has the entire burden of reproduction, and that's something which keeps her away from the economic world, leading to this kind of a dichotomy between the public and the private. And the sexual division of labor, it was not only seen within the family, you will also see it in the workplace as well. There are certain jobs which are assigned to be the men's job, certain jobs which are meant to be the women's job. And even if you are in a profession where both can be accommodated, we leave certain spaces. It has a gendered way of dividing it. So women suffer from triple burden of domestic work, reproduction, and production. So that was the major arguments they were coming up with. So when it comes to dismantling this dichotomy, be it the dichotomy of public versus private or nature versus culture, women's daily experience of struggle, it has become a means to understand the interconnections between the public and the private. And their role actually seems to be an extension of the private realm. For example, if you look at the first education report of 1948, popularly known as the Radhakrishnan report, it has identified three, appropriate jobs for women. Firstly, either you can be a primary teacher, a primary school teacher, not a, you know, you can the woman's role is not suited for teaching students in higher education or in secondary education, because that requires longer periods of training, and in that case it will allow women to, devalue and at the same time neglect the domestic sphere. Second was about the idea of nursing. They have clearly discouraged women to take up uh, medicine as a course, and nursing was seemed it seemed to be appropriate, because as I told you earlier, it seems to be an extension of the roles that uh, they took they actually, conducted in the private spaces. So when it comes to education of the children, when it comes to taking care of the sick and the elderly, so basically, when you take up the role of the nurse or a primary school teacher, you are doing an extension of all those roles that you have been doing at home. So that was one of the major arguments that they were coming up with. Then you have
So,
Kate Millett.
Dr. Mohanty, can I request a clarification?
Yeah,
What is this concept of public and private? I could not. Yeah, I'm
actually,
not
it
very
is an
clear.
extension. It is an extension of yesterday's class. So
Yeah, I didn't attend. Would you please clarify in a few seconds?
in few seconds, basically, when we talk about
Okay.
the, yeah, just let me complete. When you talk about the public comprises of some institutions like the state, the economy, the law, and the private actually comprises of institutions like family, religion, and the nation. The state belongs to the public, but the nation belongs to the private. There are certain debates associated with it, and maybe I would be running out of time if I still try to go into the details of it right now, sir. So let me just
Thank you.
complete.
Thank you.
Let me just complete. We can take questions after that. So you have somebody like Kate Millett, who in her work Sexual Politics, she writes that, power is political, and exercise of power within a household also has a political dimension. So basically, we have always thought that the private space is apolitical in nature, because yesterday we have already discussed that there is a kind of a power dynamics that you always see in the public space, in the public realm. But the private can also be nuanced, and there is this popular slogan by Carol Hanich who says that personal is political. When she says that personal is political, she says that, whenever for a very long period of time we were, not having any kind of legislation for domestic abuses, and if you, try to go to the police or complain about it, they would, have this kind of an approach that it is something which is within the family, it's a family matter, it is between the husband and the wife. So basically the radicals were trying to, scream about this particular slogan that personal is political. Whatever happens within the household, it also has a political dimension. There is a power play in it. And if you remember, yesterday we were discussing about the aspect of intra household inequality. That is also something which is again an outcome of the power dynamics that takes place within the household. So the separation between the private and the public with the hierarchical relations, they have produced certain gendered institutions and practices. So you have certain law with regard to marriage, divorce, reproduction. Again, the radicals, they believe that, it has been completely appropriated by the men, and there is a domination of the public sphere over the private, and that always happens. If you remember, yesterday we were discussing about the dominance of state in terms of certain family planning policies, which has somehow been imposed on the private realm. So it's not only that you equate the public with the men and the private with the women, but at the same time, when you consider women to be subversive to men, there is a kind of a subversive relation of the private with the public. So the focus of research on this public formal official setup was opposed to private. So whenever we talked about research, if you're doing serious research, we believe that it has to be on the public realm. You are talking about the economy, you are talking about the legal system, you're talking about entrepreneurship, the business models. You're doing something serious. When you are talking about something like gender relations, when you are talking about all those aspects which belong to the private realm, it was considered to be quite non-serious. And that was again a kind of as I was telling you yesterday, that there was a dominant perspective. You tend to see things from the point of view of a man, and that's how research in social science have been shaped in that way, for which we have neglected not only the women's voice, but all those institutions, all those whenever we talk about technology, normally we don't give much value to those technologies that is being used by women. So traditionally you have these epistemologies of history, science, social sciences, which have always excluded the voice of the women. So, feminists after the 1970s, they, started talking about research methodology having, missing out on a gynocentric approach. Research methodology was considered to be androcentric, and as all other institutions. So, feminists like Smith, she argued that sociology was unreflective and presented women from a man's standpoint. That's the reason why, if you remember, we were discussing yesterday about certain aspects of uh, conducting research, and when we were talking about the various databases, for example, census report, when we're talking about GDP of the countries, somehow it did not reflect the contributions of women, because women's contribution did not have an exchange value. Exchange value, the very idea of use value and exchange value, these terms have been borrowed from Marxian uh, philosophy. Uh, for example, if you see, yesterday we were discussing that how the role of a mother is important in a family. The day she falls sick, you tend to buy those services that she has been providing for free from the market. So for example, I would say that you take drinking water from your tap, that comes free, and we cannot live without water. It has a use value. But when I say that you buy a, a bottle of Bisleri, it has an exchange value. So that is how women's work and the task she has been doing, it has not been converted into exchange value. And that's the reason why it doesn't reflect in the databases that we take into consideration for research. And normally we have this perspective of a man, where we tend to see things from a man's point of view. So you have disciplines like industrial sociology, social stratification, political sociology, and they seem to be neutral. So basically, these feminists would say that there is nothing called gender neutral, because these, whether it is these disciplines, whether it is the very idea of research, they cannot be rendered genderless, and this has led to alienation of women scholars. Uh, you might have heard of the name Harriet Martineau. She has contributed immensely, and but when it comes to the classical sociological thinkers, normally we talk about Auguste Comte, Karl Marx, Emile Durkheim, or Weber, and I don't think we have ever come across a single woman sociologist in a curriculum, apart from your feminist theories, where we take gender as a piece of a tokenism. So basically they are trying to say that there is a alienation of women scholars and the way women look at things. So if you remember in our very first class, when we were discussing positivism and anti-positivism, we were talking about how Weberian thought process actually shaped the very constructivist or the anti-positivist stance. And there was this idea of intersubjectivity, or you can talk about Weber's Verstehen approach, where we tend to, was not too very impressed with the way natural scientists dealt with this concept of objectivity. He believed that we have our own subjectivities, and we use our subjectivity to understand somebody else's subjectivity. That was the Verstehen approach that we had already discussed. So, for somebody like Weber, sociology was value free in the sense that its rationality was defined by the community of social scientists and the culture that prevailed at that time. So, it is basically, he starts with this very idea that whenever you are picking up a research problem for yourself, you tend to do so with a kind of an inclination which is very very subjective. Why do I pick up a theme like, say, domestic violence, or a theme of caste inequality? Maybe because it was something which has hit me hard. I have certain experiences, or at some point of life, it has moved me. So Weber would say that, when your choice of topic itself has a subjective inclination, uh, we we actually do not believe in the kind of objectivity that natural scientists talk about. And after that, once the topic has been selected, which of course has a subjective kind of an inclination, after that you tend to, the research process and the techniques would take its own course. It will, you be choosing your sample accordingly. You will have a scientific process of doing so, so that will fall in line. So for Weber, as I told you, it was not value free. The choice of the topic itself is cannot be value free, but once the choice is made, then the study would be taken in a value free manner. So you would be conducting the study following certain norms of research, which could be said to be value free. So objectivity, according to Weber, has certain ontological orientations for researchers. And feminists, basically they were saying that the kind of research that was being taken up right from its very inception, it has somehow made gender invisible. The way a woman looks at something and a man does, there would be a difference. So it cannot have a value free premise. So we started with positivism, which talked about reason, rationality, empiricism, the very idea of objectivity, and they have all said that it has excluded women. And these ideas of the dominant, when you talk about the dominant paradigms of research, they had their own commonsensical locations. And if you remember, we were talking about the relationship between common sense and sociology. And when it comes to feminist methods, they believe that somehow it was like challenging the commonsensical locations, because common sense always, it depends on the dominant paradigm. It always depends on the, you can say in Marxian term, the ideas of the ruling class. So, when you talk about sociology of knowledge, it claims that knowledge is socially constructed. So, it bears the imprint of social classes, communities, groups. The groups could be any group: a caste group, a class group, a gender group. So the systems of knowledge have been overtly marginal, but they need to be political. So somehow feminist approach was considered to be political, and there were false dichotomy between political and academic approaches, because that was of late they started saying that when you talk about uh, racial studies, Dalit studies, you're talking about disability studies, as such you will tend to have certain inclinations that cannot be completely value free. That's the basic difference between a Marxian perspective and a Weberian perspective, because Marx has certain inclination for a certain group, that was the marginalized community. So when we talk about this false dichotomy that academic is something which is completely value free, and when you talk about the political approaches, they have certain inclinations. This is a point where you will see that interface between the political and the academic approaches, and basically it will be visible in these fields where we talk about the racial studies, feminist studies, Dalit studies, or you know you can talk about disability studies for that matter. So there are certain examples being cited here, if you can see. uh, the first point says that rising divorce rate is there because of educated women. Second would say rising divorce rate comes of men, because is there because men are unwilling to treat wives as equal. Third, educated women are breaking out of bad marriages. Maybe when you make a comparison between all these three statements, and you tend to back it up with certain data, you would say that yes, more number of divorce cases are seen among educated women. The data would support it, but again it is like a kind of a commonsensical statement. So you tend to make the analysis still more critical. Rising divorce rate is there because men are unwilling to treat wives as equal, and still you tend to make it still more critical. Educated women are breaking out of bad marriages. So here, this is something which is again fortifying a, a point of view which would come from the women's side rather than the men's side. So maybe these three can be treated as three different statements, but they might be having same kind of a meaning. But the way you have to take it, the way it has been interpreted, it has a lot to say. As I told you, that there is a commonsensical inclination in these statements, and at the same time you see it through a gendered lens. So if you look at the works of Talcott Parsons, he comes with this assumption that women would fit in to these expressive roles and men belong to the instrumental roles. I believe you have read Talcott Parson in your sociological theories paper. So this method is an outcome of the feminist movement that took place from the 60s onwards, where they started challenging every basic commonsensical things that dominated the world. They believe that everything is from a man's point of view. In media studies, they say that the camera is like the eyes of a man, because we talk about the male gauge. The reason being that it's taken for granted that the average audience is the man, because for a very long period of time it was the men who had the purchasing power, and it was the men who were buying the tickets. So basically they were considered to be the average audience. So the they would like to have a kind of a portrayal which would be from a man's point of view. For example, if you see, okay, there is a voyeuristic scene, it is like, all the audience are the men. They would focus on those aspects of a woman's body that would make the men happy. So the basis of feminist knowledge, it basically emerged from the radical movement that came with the second wave of feminism. The relationship of the researched and the researcher was a hierarchical one. If you remember, we were discussing about the different perspectives that is being adopted in the positivist and in the constructivist approaches. So when it comes to quantitative studies, we believe that, there is a basic gap between the knower and the one that needs to be known, and you are out there to study something. It is like an object of inquiry for the researcher. So there is a sense of hierarchy that is being associated with it. But when you are talking about qualitative studies, you tend to be one with the researched. When I'm talking about, the different perspective, the perspective of an observer that you tend to take up in quantitative approaches, and that of an actor, where you try to be a part of the participant in the community. You just forget your entire role, your entire task as a researcher, and you be one with them. You tend to feel the fear, the anxiety, the kind of sufferings they are going through, and that hierarchy gets dismantled here. So the researcher is the knower, and the researcher is somebody that needs to be known. There lies a power relationship, a hierarchical relationship, and what at one point of time the feminist methods, they would say that you need to dismantle this hierarchy. The research does not share their true experiences here, because the gap between the researcher and the research is still existing. The moment you tend to bridge the gap, you tend to be one with the researched, and you tend to empathize with them, then only that gap will go away. So the feminist proposed for a phenomenological, methodological, approach for registering your experiences. As I told you earlier in my last class, that when we talk about phenomenology, we started using phenomenology of late, because we were obsessed with positivism, because we always had the need that sociology as a discipline need to be made a science. It should have the legitimacy of the science, the natural sciences. And that's the reason, we started aping the methods, the perspective, the approaches that natural scientists took up, because we were, into this mad race of making it a science. And after 100, 200 years of practicing this positivist position, we realize that at the end of the day we are not dealing with objects or inanimate objects. We are dealing with human beings, and the most important things that we are missing out on is human experience, human feelings, human emotions, and their belief system. And we always had this fear that if we tend to engage in these entities as an object of research, maybe somebody would declare that we are being unscientific. So that is how we started talking about a phenomenological approach that was based on human experience. That okay, we actually do not need to prove something to be true or prove something to be untrue. We are not bothered about it the way positivists are, because the sole aim of positivists is to unravel the absolute truth. And what is this absolute truth? Trying to know the truthfulness of certain facts or events. But the fact might stand in its own position. I'm really not bothered about that truthfulness of that fact, but how, as a human being, or how, as a member of the community, I'm perceiving that particular fact. If you remember, I was telling you about an example of of a person encountering uh, a snake. It's dark in the night, and you have mistaken a piece of rope to be a snake. So at the end of the day, you scream and you have your heart almost in your mouth, and you feel that you are almost dead, you have been beaten up by the snake. But then you realize that no, oh my god, it's just a piece of rope, and it's so stupid of me. But the very fact that it is not a snake and it is a piece of rope, it has been falsified. But can your experience, your fear and anxiety that you had for those fraction of seconds, can it be proved to be untrue? I believe you would be reacting in the same manner had you encountered a real snake, isn't it? So that is a kind of a phenomenological approach to research. For example, when just take the example of the this Niyamgiri movement. Niyamgiri, if you see from the perspective of an educated middle class background that most of you come from, you will feel that how stupid those tribals are. Why don't they try to give up the life? What is there in that life? You know, they are residing in jungles. They are making their future generations future dark, and they could have accepted the government's what you say take on it, and they could have taken the compensation money, they could have let go of that mountain and that hill. But if you see that thing from the perspective of the Dongriya Kandhas who are residing there, they would say that there was this very famous slogan by one of these elderly women from that community who said that I don't want the caste that you are providing me, I don't want an alternative job, I don't want a home in your housing colony. What I need is that you replace this jungle with another jungle, give me another jungle. So basically, if you see things from their perspective, they have a different social system. They don't need to be or lead the lives the way we have been doing. So maybe we are in this mad race of making money, and at the end of the day, we will spend all that money and end up in a hospital. They would say that no, we breathe the pollution free air, we eat healthy, we live healthy. So they have a different perspective. And if you make a comparison between us and them, so basically we belong to different social systems with different skills altogether. If we ask any one of you to reside in these jungles, maybe you will not be in a position to survive on a single day. So same thing happens for them. So basically what I'm trying to say here is it is uh, it is that kind of a human experience that we value as a researcher. And when they say that okay, that Niyamgiri hill is the seat of our god, I as a middle class educated person, you can just shrug it off that, how superstitious they are. They think that there is god in that mountain which is rich in bauxite. They could have made so much of revenue. The state could have made so much of revenue with it. So that is, a different approach, where I am not again dealing with the truthfulness or the falsity of the fact that whether god exists in those hills or not, but the very idea of trying to understand their perception of god, their perception of that hill, rather than making sense of the mineral content of the hill. So that is basically, trying to register the experiences. So similarly, the feminist approach would say that for a very long period of time, positivist has forced you to let go of those human experiences that that exists, and that we believe that it is not fit enough to be taken as an object of inquiry, because we need to think scientifically, and in order to measure, in order to testify something, in order to prove something's truthfulness, these things might create problems. So that is how, when it comes to feminist research methods, we started saying that qualitative methods has an edge over quantitative methods, because they take into account human experience. Gorlick says that there is a need to identify the unseen, and here mostly, the not, it's not only the voice of the women but the perspectives of the women. Everything, it has not been registered yet. So she compares women to the proletariats, and there is a need for realization of proletariats that capitalism perpetuates due to them. Similarly, the role of women in home and workplace, that needs to be brought out both as an object of research, and the data that we keep gathering, and the kind of databases we have, it always has been taken from a man's point of view. So after 1970s, western feminist scholars, they started incorporating in studies of history, literature, philosophy, and social sciences, and that is how women studies departments, they got institutionalized. So whenever we talk about feminist methods, there are different stages of development. Stage 1, there is an emphasis on sex difference and to what extent it has its bearing. Like as a researcher, if you are on the field, so how your entire identity based on your gender would make a difference. Second stage, focus on the individual level sex roles and socialization process. you know uh, the way I have tuned up my personality, that depends on the sex roles that I have been carrying out, and the impacts of socialization in my entire life. Third, centrality of gender as an organizing principle in all forms of social systems. You know, we have to think in terms of gender as an organizing principle. For example, if you are taking up a study on artisans, say, you know the kind of job that these artisans do, so try to have a gender division of labor as to what are the roles in that process that men take up and women take up. The very idea of agriculture, you know we always had this image that when I say a farmer, normally we have a man in one's head, but it is it the recent studies, they show that apart from uh, plowing, rest of the jobs on the field are conducted by women, but we can never give the tag of being a farmer to a woman. And the reasons could be many. The reasons could be that they have no property rights. They have we don't we we think that the trivial jobs like soaking the seeds or planting the saplings or harvesting these are like very trivial. They do not pass off as proper agricultural tasks, so maybe women are able to do it. So we somehow have abstained from giving them this tag of being a farmer. So this is what they have been pointing out. So talking about the key features of feminist methodology, you would see that in comparison to traditional approaches to sociology, the current feminist approach highlights on violence, control, ideology as a structure, inequality, and Maria Mies has given the methodological guideline to feminist research. She has talked about a need to replace value free research with a bias towards women's movement. The bias has to be there when we are talking about the normativeness. If you remember when we were discussing about objectivity in one of the classes. So there is a need for both conscientization of the researchers and the researched. And take for example, when you are trying to do a household survey, normally what you pick up one person from one household when you are doing a household survey. And who that one person is? That one person, we believe that it has to be the head of the family, which is mostly a man. So women would refrain to talk about the entire thing. They would say that the men are not available, or the men of the household would say that oh, she doesn't know anything, maybe you come during this part of the day, I would be available and I will tell you. So basically we have without we don't do it consciously, but unknowingly we have registered the experiences of men only. So now you consider household work. Do we consider household work as work? Because after these debates of the 1970s, the very definition of work has undergone a change. Because earlier we used to take up consider something to be work when it has certain exchange value. After this as I was telling you yesterday, the 1975 ICSR report, that was called Towards Equality, we started sensitizing the census officials that no, you know the task of a woman, the work that a woman does within the limits of the household, it can also be considered to be work. So that was the reason why we had these kind of flawed census reports and all kinds of databases that said that women do not work, while you will see women working everywhere, right from the early morning till the very late in nights. It is the woman who works, but at the end of the day, these data reflected that women actually do not engage in any kind of work. So that was a kind of a flawed data that we have been conducting, and the reason for that being that we had not sensitized the census officials properly. And the lack of the sensitization was because there was this commonsensical approach towards understanding the idea of work, towards grasping all those invisible things which is not visible to the naked eye. As I was telling you that, okay, who do I see as an artisan? Oh, I see a man out there. So take for example, uh, you go to Rajpur and you just take an account of these painters, and if you take a survey, maybe you will find that majority of them are men. So does it mean that it is only the men who actually contribute to this kind of handicrafts? But you, as a researcher, you have to, ask them, extract these things. That okay, right from the very process, you have to be aware of what are the processes that they, undergo while, creating a piece of handicraft. They tend to have a piece of cloth who is actually and they tend to have a paste of say tamarind seeds over that cloth. So basically, who is the person who is actually preparing that very cloth to be painted? It is mostly the women of the household who actually soak these seeds. They make a paste out of it. They rub it on the, on that piece of cloth. They get it dried. So basically, these are the hidden tasks which are not visible. So, as a researcher, you have to make gender as an organizing principle, and you have to look for those hidden things. And basically, after that, you have to challenge the separation between the public and the private. That would come only when you challenge these hidden things, and only when you see what is not recognized and what is invisible completely. So, when you talk about these feminist methodology, it recognizes the diversity of gender statuses in social order. For example, take migration studies. Who migrate more? It is the men or the women. So, you know, we are always under the impression that it is the men who migrate and women do not. But basically, when we have started looking at the nuances, it now seems that migration is, you will find equal number of migrants both among men and women, or statistics say something else. So we actually go mostly by our commonsensical understanding, and these commonsensical understandings have been provided from man's point of view, which seems to be, the dominant ideas of our stance. And then, as I was telling you, you have to adopt a reflexive stance where you tend to question your own understanding. This is my analysis. When I say that, okay, this is my understanding of the thing, and this is how I have analyzed things. So why do I have this kind of a notion? What is the source of it? I, as a researcher who is into social sciences, has to question one's own, inferences at every point of time, so that we need to check the biases that creeps into our mind without our conscious knowledge. As I was telling you yesterday, that the basic difference between a natural scientist and a social scientist is that when a natural scientist is looking under the microscope, he is he or she is able to see a substratum of which he or she is not a part. But when you are looking into the microscope as a social scientist, you are also a part of that substratum. So there would be an inherent bias in your entire understanding, and it is our duty, it is our training of this particular discipline in terms of methodology, in terms of its approaches, that we have to keep these biases at bay. So basically, the most challenging task for a researcher in social science is to take up a reflexive task, as to where you are not allowing a single idea of yours to sink in without being examined. You tend to question every idea of yours at every step, that why do I hold this kind of a idea? Because is it because of my background? Is it because of my gender that I believe that, if I am a woman and I think, women work more than men? Is it because of my own gender? Is it because of my own experience? Is it because of my own family? Why do I hold these kind of opinions or ideas? So you have to be very critical of yourself, which not necessarily a natural scientist has to, because a natural scientist is dealing with not himself. Because you have to remember that apart from studying the members of the community, you yourself is a member of the same community. That is the basic difference and the basic challenge that you face. So here you have to see that the study of man cannot be equated with the study of mankind. Studies on women was as required to bring women from the margins to the center, and it was assumed that all women to be same. But no, the reason why feminism as a movement failed, because it did not address all categories of women. So when I say women, we have a standard middle class women as somebody who is an index for the entire society, or who is representing that society. So that the same thing happened for the feminist movement, because it was the white middle class western woman who was sought to be the voice of the entire women category. But you have so many women. You have women of different classes, you have women of different racial backgrounds, you have black women, you have brown women, you have women who third world countries women, how their experiences are different from the first world country women. And one single category of women cannot actually represent everyone. So you have the intersections of race, caste, class whenever you are talking about gender. So gender is not just an organizing principle here, but you have to take all these different organizing principles together. And it celebrated the idea that knowledge is situated from a particular standpoint. Presenting knowledge as universal is flawed. So that's the basic take of feminism, that you cannot take any kind of knowledge, any kind of perspective to be universal. There are different groups, and everybody has their own idea of understanding things. They have their own knowledge practices, and that's the reason we have arrived at a fact, unlike the positivist position, which believes that knowledge is universal and there is just one existing absolute knowledge. No, they would talk about, the present generation of researchers would talk about multiple truths. So I have my own truth. When I make a comparison between the Niyamgiri tribes and myself, I would say that, okay, this is my truth, this is their truth. My truth is shaped by my socio-economic location. My truth is, shaped by my understanding of my own society. They have a different society. They have a different, societal understanding. Their experience is so very different from mine. So it is basically my experience that is, shaping my ideas. So women's experience is fundamental to understand their realities. So here, you need to see that research needs to be taken up from the standpoint of the marginalized. And there is an existence of sexual division of labor, which means lives of women are completely different from that of the men. If you make a comparison between a husband and the wife who are into the same profession, maybe the woman has the extra burden of household chores, of taking, of the responsibilities of reproduction. So the way she perceives the world would be different from that of a man's. So basically what they are trying to see is that you take woman as a different category, and at the same time you have to use the lens of intersectionality, where you bring in the other categories like race, like class, caste into the category of gender. So you have Patricia Hills Collins, who says that drawing on collective experience of subjugation of blacks, the black women feel marginalized by black men and white women. So basically, if you ask a Dalit woman or a black woman that, what is your take on feminism, and especially when you see that the second wave gave the clarion call that there is this value of universal sisterhood. Here, perhaps a woman from the black community would say that, I see the white woman as one of my oppressors. How can I take her to be my sister? So you have women being doubly oppressed not only because of their class, as the way men are, but also because of their gender. And at the same time, when you talk about Dalit women would say that, they have triple oppression. The oppression because of their gender, because of their class, and because of their caste. So that is how there are varieties of human experiences based on your socio-economic locations. So similarly, for a feminist researcher, she settles between two consciousness. Firstly, being trained as a sociologist, and the idea of being a woman. So I'm a trained sociologist, and at the same time I am a woman. So how do I see the world? So how a male's sociologist's perspective would vary from that of a woman's. So for Smith, sociology is not organized around impersonality or anonymity. If you remember, mostly in our basic courses in research methodology, we tend to, have the structured kind of a writing that the researcher, we tend to write it in third person. Why we do that? Because we tend to maintain objectivity, we tend to have this kind of a stance that I am not being biased by anything. So Smith would say that, maintaining this idea of impersonality or anonymity doesn't help, because you know is it that at the end of the day, research methodology is a course that teaches you to pretend? No. I have seen domestic abuse all my life, and that's the reason I have taken up this topic. So my fieldwork period could be that of 6 months. I have been trained, as a sociologist, but at the same time, I have grew up registering certain incidents where I will not only, take that into account, but at the same time, my training as a sociologist would sometimes help me critique my own notions. So that this is where you are negotiating between your own experiences as a woman in the community, as a member of the community, as a sociologist, as a member of the same caste group or a different caste group. So the negotiation process of that of a researcher, it goes on, and that is how you tend to remain, you arrive at a point. So today we talk about the very idea of postmodernism that has challenged the unified conception of women, because postmodernism itself, as a theory, as a socio-cultural condition, it has evoked the very idea of fragmentation, that the way reality has been fragmented. I don't know if you are aware of postmodernism, but you know uh, it talks about certain fragmented experiences. It doesn't believe in a historicity. So it doesn't believe in any unified conception, be it that of a woman or be it a unified conception of reality. So the kind of research would claim that all research is politically and socially invested. So uh, Ramjan argue that we need to recognize the material reality, like access to resources, which constrains one's choices. The role of a poor woman would be different from that of a white woman. And when I say choices, it also, if you have read Naila Kabir, you would see that choices actually emerge from your access to those resources. If I don't have access, I would not choose, and I can have a different hierarchy of choices depending on my access. And at the same time, the more choices I have, I would say that the more empowered I am. So that is how, your access to those resources would constrain your choices, that, emerges from your positions, your racial position, your caste position, your class position, apart from your gender positions. Okay. Yeah. Any doubts? Any clarifications? Could you take
Um,
a break? Yeah, yeah, please. Please come up.
no, ma'am.
Yeah.
No, ma'am. You can please continue.
And there is Dr. Dibakar Sarangi. Okay. Public versus private concept. Uh, yeah, these are, some of these basics, and it is very difficult for me to give a clarity, because I am not being able to take a class on every unit. You must see that I have been assigned one block which comprises of almost 5 to 6 units, and I have to cover it within 1 2 hours. That's my basic problem. So if you read those texts, it's the best idea is to go through the text and then attend the classes, so that I can, but I'm not in a position to clarify each of these little basic concepts, because I'll be running out of time, and maybe I will not be able to cover 8 of your blocks, because I have been given 8 blocks to be covered in 8 classes. Yeah. So maybe we can take a break of 10 to 12 minutes and meet after that, where I will take up your class on, say, research designs and some of the sampling techniques. No, before that, I'll have to, tell you a little bit on participatory approach. I do not want to miss out on that as well. Okay, let's just take a break for 10 minutes, 10 to 12 minutes. Okay, welcome back. Just stop presenting the slide. Uh, you have another approach, that is participatory approach. But participatory approach, similarly like feminist approach, doesn't believe in the so-called values free quantitative kind of studies that we take up. So it's a very short chapter. You can actually go through it from the material. I think I need to move on to the next block today. At least I have to start that block today, else I will not be in a position to finish up your course. So I will take up research designs today, which is extremely important when it comes to research. I'll be sharing the slides. Please prompt me if you're able to see it or not. So basically, what do you mean by a design? Design, as the term itself refers, it could be an outline of something. You are trying to plan something, you are arrange something. So for everything, you tend to have a design. Before you give your dress to the tailor for stitching, you tend to give a layout or an architecture. He makes a design of certain things before he really does it. So basically, it is a blueprint before the work has actually begun. And when you talk about research design, it is a process of making research related decision before the situation arises. So, research has always been an expensive affair. So you go to the field, you track your respondents, you track your key informants, but before doing everything, do I have all my instruments intact or not? I have to ask this question, that are my instruments intact? Am I doing it the right way? Or you would have to repeat it. You will come back from field, and then you'd realize, oh, I could have asked this question, oh, I missed out on this data. That often happens with us as researchers. Or I made a blunder by not visiting that community or that colony, and instead I did this. So we always give afterthoughts, and we miss out on many things by the time we complete our research process. So that's what a design is meant for, where you are trying to plan a strategy for conducting research. Because as I told you, research is an expensive affair. You spend not only your money, your time, and your energy on certain things, and if you don't get the maximum benefit out of it, it will be futile. So you need a detailed plan, and for that you need to understand what your goals are. What is it that you are actually trying to look into, and what strategies, what approaches do I need to take into consideration before I start this process. So when I talk about a design constitutes the blueprint of the collection, measurement, and analysis of data. So it plans what to be observed. Basically, in every research proposal, we have these 5 questions. What? What is basically your research objectives? What you are trying to study? What exactly you are trying to look at with this piece of research? So when it comes to the research questions, they are the basic questions that you are trying to frame and you have in mind while you are conducting research. How it is to be observed. The second question, how, pertains to the methodology you are trying to use. Third question, when and where is it to be observed? When is the timeline of research? At what point of time, whether it is going to be a cross sectional study, a longitudinal study. If you remember, yesterday we were talking about historical method, where you are taking the past into consideration and you are trying to take into account a temporal reference frame. So this pertains to the when question. What is the time frame of research? What time period you are trying to take into consideration, and where is the spatial dimension of that research? It is time and space, when and where it is to be observed. Why is it to be observed? It is the rationale behind the study. Why do you think that this study would be appropriate to be taken up at this point of time, that it is still contemporary and it is still relevant, why it is significant? So I have to justify my my position of taking that research into consideration. Then how to record my observation? It is about your data collection processes, how to analyze, interpret observation, how to generalize. It is about your analysis. So basically you have this five things at your tips when you conduct a research. You keep these five things in mind and you have a robust research methodology before you. So here I have identified some of the important definitions of research design. Winner has compared research design to an architect's plan for the structure of a building. Myers' research design is the general structure of the experiment, not its specific contents. It is the structure. Thayer says that research design is a blueprint or a detailed plan for how to conduct research study, how to complete the same. And Kerlinger, on the other hand, for him, research design is a basic plan, structure, strategy of investigation that is conceived so as to obtain answer to research questions and control variance. How you can answer those questions, how you can control some of the variances that you see around yourself. So these are the basic definitions of research questions. Research design. Functions. Black and Champion, they have given these three important functions of a design. The first thing is it provides a blueprint for research. It limits the boundaries of research activities. You tend to, because sometimes research gets addictive. You go on and on and on, forgetting that you have a degree to complete, forgetting the time frame, and it gets so exciting and interesting that you know you go beyond everything, because the more you dig, the deeper you go. But here a design is important because it keeps you reminding that okay, this part could be interesting, but I could take it some other point of time. For my PhD degree or for my MA dissertation, I need to draw the line that these are the things I am trying to cover and these are the things that I am trying to leave out. So that is the reason why you need to have a design, because it helps you to draw the boundaries as to what you need to take up and what you need to leave behind. Because as I told you, research is an expensive affair where you are not only consuming time, money and energy, but a lot of your future potentialities also depend on it. Then it enables investigation to anticipate potential problems. That okay, I had actually chosen these research problems, these were my objectives, but at the end of the day I found something very interesting. It can be taken as a further study in maybe in some future point of time. So it is needed because it facilitates the smooth conduct of research operations. Okay, before talking about the fetches of a research design, let me explain one thing to you. Whenever we are talking about a research design, there are certain things that you have to keep in mind. A research design has mostly three important components. The first thing is the worldview that is associated with the design. What is a worldview? You know, if you remember in the first class, we were talking about different approaches: positivism, constructivism, pragmatism. You know, these uh, actually constitute a worldview, because every research problem is located in a particular worldview. Say, as I told you, you are taking up a study on migration. So, what is it exactly that you are trying to look into? Are you trying to look into the rate of migration, whether the rate of migration has increased or decreased over the decade? The trend from urban to rural or rural to urban has come up more, or transnational migration is more you know into vogue these days. So, am I trying to look at this trend? If that is so, what kind of worldview do I need to take into consideration? Can any of you answer? We have discussed this already in the previous classes. Okay, I have told you again and again that whenever we are talking about, trend, we need a quantitative kind of a study. And whenever there is a quantitative study, you have to take the positivist worldview. Had I been talking about the experiences of being a woman migrant, or experiences of a migrant in a strange city who is, struggling with all kinds of socio-economic problems, then I could have gone for a phenomenological approach. I could have talked about a constructivist or an anti-positivist approach. So basically, these are the approaches which is associated with the research problem. The problem calls for the kind of worldview I will take into consideration. The kind of problem I will have, I will try to have a corresponding approach to the research question. Second thing is the strategy or the methods. Every worldview is not only associated with the research problem, but it has certain associated methods with it. So the methods could be, when I'm talking about positivism, you could, talk about any quantitative method. So these quantitative methods could be, could you give me an example of a quantitative method? It could be survey, it could be your experiment method. So when I'm talking about constructivist worldview, I will go for a qualitative method. And the qualitative methods could be anything. It could be ethnography, it could be participant observation, it could be a case study method. So basically, every research problem calls for a research perspective. The research perspective goes hand in hand with the methods of inquiry, and those methods are again associated with certain tools and techniques. So basically, what are the tools? The tools could be the tools of data collection that you are using. It could be, you know your questionnaire, it could be your interview schedule, your interview guide. These are the tools or instruments on the part of a social scientist. So now talking about the phases of research design. So there are different phases of research design. You have to state the problem first. What your research problem is about, statement of the problem. And the second thing that you need to know is to, you have to identify what things have not yet been covered. Suppose I am looking into the case of poverty, and I would like to know what are the studies that is available on poverty, and what aspect of poverty has not yet been taken into consideration. And for that, I have to review a wide range of literature. Then the third point is operationalizing the concepts. So, what concepts do I need to take into consideration? No, poverty, there are so many different types of poverty. You talk about absolute poverty, you talk about relative poverty. Today, we have so many different ideas associated with poverty. We talk about multidimensional poverty, we talk about cultural poverty, we talk about social poverty, we talk about poverty in terms of social capital. Uh, so we talk about so many deprivations, and they pass off as different forms of poverty. So how do I operationalize that concept? Means, for the purpose of my study, I am not in a position to take up all aspects of poverty. So I will choose accordingly as to what aspects of poverty I would take into consideration. I would say that for this particular subject, I will take up, say, the idea of poverty that is associated with the societal aspects. For example, something like social capital along with economic capital. Normally, today we say that when somebody is poor, it is not just about money, or it is not just about the economic values that is associated with wealth and assets. For example, when somebody is poor, that person also lags behind on some other capital. It is not just economic capital, it could be social capital. Social capital could be understood in terms of certain networks that you have. Say 10 year down the line, you all have been in important positions, and you, at the end of the day, I would be in certain need. So I might be having one of my friends, say, in the police force, and I have got some issues. So I will call up that person and say that, you see, I am your friend, I was in your batch, and after introducing myself, I will try to take that help. So basically that person might respond. So this is the idea of your social capital. So when a person is poor, he or she not only lacks economic capital, they don't have the kind of connections, social connections, that a person from the upper or the middle class socio-economic locations do possess. Or you take talk about something like cultural capital. Cultural capital could be the kind of skills that you have. It could be your communication skills, it could be your language proficiency, it could be your skill of writing, or your skill of grasping certain abstract concept. So these could be some of the skills which an ordinary individual who doesn't hail from the kind of socio-economic locations that you come from, that other person might be lacking. For example, you have two students from different socio-economic background. One from the middle class, who has covered his or her studies from an English medium school. The other comes from a slum. So the person who is from the slum might have a better understanding than the person who is coming from the middle class, but he or she lacks certain communication skills. I don't have the expression of language. Maybe my English is not that proficient. So that's the kind of a cultural capital one misses out on. So when one is poor, we say that poverty is multidimensional. Okay, so you have these deprivations which are economic in nature, which are cultural in nature, or political in nature, or social in nature. So I'm trying to identify these different ideas of poverty. And in my study I would say that no, I am just looking into, say, economic poverty, or I'm just looking into the idea of social poverty. I will not take the other aspects for this study. So this is how you operationalize the concepts. Then, in order to identify your variables, okay, if I'm talking about economic poverty, or I'm talking about cultural poverty, I need to identify certain variables. So what creates those deprivations in you? Say for example, I'm talking about cultural poverty. So language could be one, communication skills could be one, your I would say that your ability to use computers could be one, because it is again there is a uh, class nuanced associated with it. I am somebody who belongs to a well-off family. I have handled a computer right from the beginning, but this person is seeing a computer for the first time in the life. So that nuance would be there. So I would try to identify that, okay, how handling a computer could be a cultural skill, or the etiquettes of you know reaching out to people, the kind of etiquettes that is associated with you, the other person might be lacking in that. So I have to identify some of the variables that comes with those concepts. Then I have to fix a sample. I have to you know say that what is going to be my universe. How do I identify my universe? Now I'm talking about poor people. Am I trying to do it in a particular locality? I have to justify what locality I have taken into consideration. Secondly, I have to fix a sample size. I have to identify a sampling technique. Maybe in tomorrow's class we can take up sampling and you will have a better idea of it when I talk about it. Then I have to specify the tools of the study. And what are the tools? I have just pronounced it few seconds ago. What makes an instrument or tool in social science research? Anybody? Every method requires certain tools, and those tools could be your questionnaire, your interview schedule, your interview guide. It could be anything. So when if I say that survey is a method that you have taken up, your tool would be a questionnaire. So you have to specify what tool of study you are taking and why you are using that. Then you have to design the kind of study you are taking. When I talk about designing, I am again referring to the different components of a design in terms of the worldviews, the methods, and the tools. What is the worldview that you are using? Now, I am talking about cultural poverty. Had it been economic poverty, I could have used a quantitative method. I could have, taken up a positivist worldview. But here I am talking about the kind of cultural uh, exposure you have, the kind of skills you have, and these for understanding these nuances, I have to delve into human experience. I mean, how what was the experience like, when you were facing this kind of a problem. So I have to collect these narratives of deprivations and the outcomes of these deprivations. So maybe I will go for a constructivist worldview, where I can talk about case studies, or where I can talk about interviews, I can talk about ethnography as a method, and I can use the tools accordingly. Then fixing the time schedule and the budget. The money I can afford, the if at all I have received any funding for that study, what what is the amount of money, what what would be the vast expanse of my field, I'll have to allocate it accordingly, the size of my sample in that way, and fix a time limit that okay, it's an MA dissertation and I just have say 1 month with me. So maybe I will pick up a very small field. I'll take up a small sample size and conduct my study accordingly. Then coming to the characteristics of a research design. So research design possesses qualities like being flexible, suitable, applicable, resourceful, reasonable. So these are defined as a good design. It has to be flexible. I sense that okay, it is more than what I had perceived. My problem is much bigger than that. So my design should be flexible enough to accommodate the other variables that I try to adopt immediately. It has to be suitable to the question that I'm asking. It has to be applicable to the scenario, and it has to be reasonable, resourceful. So a good design is one which decreases bias, increases dependability of the data collected and investigated. One research design is appropriate for a particular research problem, and it involves certain factors: the means of obtaining information, availability and skills of the researcher and his or her staff, objectivity of the problem to be studied, nature of the problem to be studied, availability of money and time for the research work. I have to take all these characteristics to make it a good piece of design. Then types of design, you might be aware of it. We have basically four different types of design: exploratory, descriptive, diagnostic, and experimental design. What is an exploratory design? You use this kind of a design when you hardly know anything about your field. Not much is known about your field, and maybe this is the kind of design which you use in the formative years of your research. You start off with an exploratory design. As you tend to gather more knowledge, you could shift to a descriptive or any other experimental kind of design. So the basic idea of using this particular design is to gain enough information, and for that you have to go with an open mind. You have to be open to the questions, to the new scenario. You have to be that flexible. So in this case, the researcher has an idea or has observed something and it seeks to understand it. It tries to take up these questions. What is being observed? So this researchers carried out mostly when there is not sufficient information available. So you can only take up this kind of a design. Descriptive research design tries to explain, or it is interested in explaining the features of research studies. So when you are using descriptive design, you are actually describing. So when you are describing something, uh, you know every research design pertains to certain qualitative or quantitative studies. Can anyone guess if exploratory research design is used for qualitative or quantitative studies? Any guesses? Exploratory research design is used for qualitative studies only. When you are talking about descriptive research design, you tend to describe things. So when you are describing something, you can either describe it qualitatively or quantitatively. So say you have enumerated a table, with it you are actually describing it quantitatively. When you are looking into the demographic profile and we are putting everything into the table, you are describing it statistically and quantitatively. Or I can describe it qualitatively. So every data has two dimensions, quantitative and qualitative dimensions. Here, this study is concerned with specific predictions. Just a moment, I have to take a call. Okay, so what I was trying to say that with these studies, you are trying to narrate facts. You are trying to talk about the characteristics. You are just describing. Here, actually, the researcher attempts to explore and explain the topic, provide some additional information. It describes. It just goes on describing, and the facts, the events, the situations. And sometimes while describing it, you are in a position to find the idea of causality. So you tend to answer the questions as to how it is. Then the next design that you would be talking about is diagnostic research. In diagnostic research, uh, you ascertain the frequency with which something is coming up or occurring and its relationship with something else. For example, what does a doctor do? A doctor basically diagnoses you. So the doctor would identify your symptoms, and they would try to talk about the kind of illness you have, looking into the symptoms. So similarly, in a diagnostic design, you tend to find the relationship between different variables, and you tend to identify the frequency with which it is coming up. So it concerns with whether certain variables are connected or not. Is there an interrelation between these variables? So in this kind of a design, you are in a position to predict things. That okay, perhaps in 1920, a pandemic like situation had come up, but these were the different variables, and this is something that we could find after so many years. I can see the same variables, I can see the same scenario. So perhaps we might face a similar situation. So when it comes to diagnostic research, you always have with it the idea of prediction. Prediction is always associated with diagnostic research, and in diagnostic research you tend to ask what will happen, because we have these questions. Like in exploratory you are seeking this what question, in descriptive also you are seeking this what and how question. In diagnostic research you will normally ask what will happen, and basically you will tend to find solutions to something. You will tend to see that how to treat it, because it is about identifying the symptoms and diagnosing the problem. The next design is your experimental research design. It is again, and you know let me tell you again, exploratory research design, it is a qualitative research design. Descriptive could be used for both quantitative and qualitative, and it is mostly used in quantitative because you are describing things quantitatively as well as qualitatively. Diagnostic is also a quantitative design. Experimental research design is a quantitative research design. It explains the cause of a phenomena. Okay, why this thing has appeared. So basically, you are trying to compare between two things, but experimental method is different from comparative method. I have told you, we have discussed comparative method yesterday. And in experimental method, what you do, you select a timeline. It looks at how things come together and interact. And basically, in this kind of a design, you are trying to study, social policy. You are trying to evaluate that. Okay, say the government has, introduced your SHG groups, the very idea of microfinance in some of these villages. In one village, there is microfinance. In another village, there is no microfinance. So I will try to evaluate which is doing economically better. So I will take up a timeline as to when did microfinance first come up in this kind of a village, and then I will try to take up the study as to how it has influenced and it has, economically developed the communities in that particular village, and how the other village which doesn't have microfinance, uh, has not been doing as good as the previous one. So this is how I take two different groups. One is the experimental group, and so the experimental group is always the one which has that variable, and here the variable is microfinance. And the other one is control group. Control group is the one which lacks that variable. The village without microfinance institution makes it the control group, and then you tend to make a comparison between the experimental group and the control group. But one problem with these kind of designs is that, you tend to miss out on certain extraneous variables. And what are these extraneous variables? Extraneous variables could be any variable which would be affecting my study without my knowledge, without me being aware of it. For example, I am under the impression that village A has microfinance institutions, and that's the reason why it has been doing well uh, all these days. But village B, which doesn't have microfinance institution, is not economically doing well. So for me, the concluding remark is perhaps microfinance is the reason that is behind the development of village A. But there could be any extraneous variable, like say, you know, uh, village A had better irrigation facility, for which it was already in a economically stable position. It was always doing good. And village B, which had neither irrigation and neither microfinance, that's the reason it still remained poor. So can I come to the conclusion that microfinance is the reason for development of village A? So normally in these experimental research designs, there is this role of this extraneous variable which actually, plays the, you know the dicey part, which the researcher is not able to, grasp at times. So basically here the sequence is that you choose two groups which is being affected by the variable, and the other group is not being affected by the variable. Which has the variable is the experimental group, which doesn't have the variable is the control group. And it may be used to refer to plan by which subjects are assigned to experimental conditions. You have certain experimental conditions where, you take a timeline, I would say that okay, these institutions came around 2010 in this particular village, so I will take 2010 to be the baseline, and then I will try to scale its growth. So this is how I would be conducting an experimental research design. And as I told you earlier, experimental research design is a quantitative. It is mostly used for quantitative studies. And in this particular design, we tend to seek causality. So when you are seeking causality, you tend to have this question that why is it? So basically, in exploratory, you are trying to answer what. In descriptive, you are trying to answer what and how. In diagnostic, you are trying to answer what will it be. And in experimental, you are trying to answer what, why is it. Now, significance of a design. I have already told you, why we need a design. Basically, it is a plan that specifies objectives of the study and the hypothesis to be tested. So you are narrowing down, and at the same time, you are drawing the boundary as to which things you are taking into consideration and which things you have planned to leave out. Because research can take you deeper and deeper, and you might forget the deadlines. You might, every time you will have this urge that okay, there is little more that I can put into my piece of work. There is little bit more to be explored, but that little more is never enough. So that's the reason why you need to have a design where you draw the line. The design forces you to draw the line that okay, this part could be interesting, but this is what your job is done now, stop here. Maybe you can take it up for a further study, but now you have to stop. Second, it is an outline that specifies the sources and types of information relevant to the research questions. Third, it is a blueprint specifying the methods to be adopted for gathering and analyzing data. Then, it facilitates smooth conduct of research operations, and it has great bearing on the reliability of results that you arrive at. So basically, these are the advantages. Enables the researchers to consider beforehand the various decisions to be made, prevents blind search, indiscriminate gathering of data, fixes the boundaries, gives you a clear view of the objectives. You have to, pursue your goal very systematically. It helps you to anticipate potential problems. So minimizes wastage. The wastage could be wastage of time, money, and energy, and other resources. There is optimum reliability that is achieved. I'm yet to tell you about these concepts of reliability and validity. Maybe we can take it up in the next class. And then designing helps you in giving useful conclusions and theories. So that is about research design. So maybe we can stop here. If you have anything to ask, you can ask now. And maybe by the end of some of the classes, I can share some of the slides with you. But most important is that you have to give a, you know, you have to read your basic course material, because these are counseling sessions. You have to achieve a certain level of knowledge and information, so that you can take immense help of these classes. It is not possible to start from the scratch in these counseling classes, because the number of classes allotted is very limited. Any questions?
Ma'am, regarding the slides,
Yeah, I will give you. Maybe I'll just arrange it and I'll give you.
thank you.
Okay, then I'll take leave now. We'll meet tomorrow.